you're a deep thinker. You have crystal clear understanding about that technology, and you also have a strong business acumen. So you can take the technology and tie it with the business objective. I also felt that you're a great communicator, and by reading more about all the people that worked for you, I can tell that you're a strong leader. And I believe that Red Cat is lucky to have you in their team. So I just want to find out more about you from you. So tell me a little bit about you.
Well, thank you. First of all, it's a pleasure to be here. I really appreciate it. Well, I really have to go back to a lot of my upbringing. Both my parents had a lot of influence when it came to exposing me to all kinds of different cultures and worlds. And my father worked for the U.S. State Department, so we moved around a lot, and there were times, such as when we lived in Africa when I was 8 years old, where I didn't really know anyone, and there were people who were very different from me. And so I learned to adapt and to learn as much as I could about various cultures, and I think that has a lot to do with who I am. I'm a firm believer in the ability that people have to have who are successful to be able to communicate with anyone from any place at virtually any time. And doing so effectively really increases your chance of success no matter what you do.
Over the years, you worked in different companies. You worked in a lot of Fortune 500 companies. When you were with Sprint, you were a trainer there. You worked for Adobe, where you're in charge of their entire courseware development, design, webmasters, and all the people out there. And you had your own company, and at one point you're the CEO of InStack Storage. And you also worked years for eBay and PayPal. And now, of course, you're with Red Cat. What I want to find out from you is that over the years you're moving up. What made you successful?
Well, I think it really is around picking the right people to have on your team. And it's interesting, one of the things that I learned very early in my career, and I'm very grateful to some of the wonderful bosses and mentors that I had, is that if you do nothing else well and you pick the right people to work with you who complement each other and complement your strengths and weaknesses, you will have a greater chance of success. So I spent a lot of time learning how to find the right people who could make for a successful team. And the other thing that fits in very well is once I get those folks, it's a question of how can you retain them, keep them engaged, ensure that they work well with each other. And that also is something that over the years, and I continue to learn all the time, of course, you never stop learning. I've learned that you can really help people by taking an active interest in their careers and doing so in such a way that they get very drawn to you and they want to do well for you and for the team. And so those two things together, I think, have had a lot to do with my success.
How do you define right people?
Well, it's interesting. First of all, it all starts with what it is that you want to accomplish, right? I think, an example, plenty of examples in my career, early on in my career, I was learning how to develop strategies and what was a vision. And once that comes into play, then you can really start to think, okay, what are the people what skills do I need? What skills do I have? And if you've inherited a team, as I did in many situations, what skills does the team have already? And so you look for, both the hard skills, whether it's certain technical gaps or other gaps, depending on the type of teams you're managing. And then I spend a lot of time, maybe more than many people do, on the soft skills. I always, for example, like to have a person on my team who rubs everybody the wrong way just a little bit, because usually that's someone who's highly creative and has a very strong opinion, and it makes everybody else think. And so and it can't just be me doing that. Similarly, I like to have people on the team who are, at least a couple of them, who are very collaborative, who spend more time trying to build bridges and relationships than I think most people do. And the combination of those two can make for some very entertaining meetings, I can assure you of that, but also they have a lot to do with the success of the team. And then I also go to understand the working styles of each person, right? So as an example, some people who are very detail-oriented and they are wonderful at analysis, sometimes they can be in the wrong jobs. I've inherited teams where, these folks were front and center trying to be the face of the organization, and they just fail miserably and they're frustrated. So, I will look at those type of folks, and they're worth gold, right? Especially these days with the emphasis on data and analysis in all of the technology worlds in which we live. And then similarly, if you put somebody who is a dynamic speaker and has a lot of energy, talks fast and very creative in a role of analyzing mountains of data, they fail miserably and they're horribly unhappy too. So, a lot of times I find that people are often miscast. People say, oh, they're not doing a good job, and usually it's because they're not in the right role.
So what you are really saying is that it's not just having the right people in the team. How do you put the right people on the right seat?
I, years ago, was hired and I replaced someone, and everyone thought that I was going to let that person go, that I was not, why would I keep that person? Well, it turned out that she had actually been in the wrong role. In fact, she had gone forward and said to my boss at the time, before I joined, I can't do this job, you need to find somebody to replace me. And what I learned when I spoke with her was she had this incredible strategic mind. She had a problem in terms of her communication. She would talk over people, interrupt them, and wouldn't let anyone get a word in edgewise. And so we worked on that. And I actually wound up moving her to another location inside the United States to manage another team. They thought I was crazy when I did that, by the way. And I worked with her to ensure that when she sat down to introduce herself as the leader of that team, that she explained what her habits were and gave people permission to help her overcome them. And about a year later, I had people coming up to me saying, it's amazing. She is doing a great job, and we never would have guessed that she would have been right for this role. And I think she's a remarkable person. She's still in the role today, and I give her a lot of credit. And I feel very glad that she wasn't just summarily escorted out of the company when I joined.
Now, over the years, when I do the hiring, I have my own framework that I use in order to reduce the bad hiring percentage. Do you have a framework, or do you implement a form, or do you use some type of method?
I really try to focus on making sure that, first of all, various people ask questions that they believe are important to them. So I usually ask for, look, let's assess someone based on evaluate their potential for whatever position based on these dimensions. How are they in communication and collaboration? How are they in being a strategic thinker? Not everybody is, depending on the role. We don't really, we delve into that or not. How good are they at analysis? You mentioned something that's critical. How good are they at learning? I think the notion that someone comes in and can say that I know everything there is to know about whatever topic it is that they say that's their expertise is just not correct. You can't be an expert completely on everything all the time. And so we look into those dimensions. The other is, of course, there are the questions around how you actually do the work. Are you if you're someone who is a systems architect or says you're a systems architect, well, are you? Explain what you've done in the past. And so, what I really try to encourage people to do within the context of interviewing, and I do it myself, is to listen carefully, look for clues, and really try to match your questions to what you think are the most important needs for the role for which they're interviewing.
One of the things I have seen in the past, David, is that we hire people who has all the qualities that we are looking for, but they are not right cultural mix for the organization. So how does culture plays into your entire hiring process?
Well, it's a very important question. And of course, the first thing is you have to be very open and honest with yourself about what the culture really is in the organization which you have. So for example, years ago, I moved into a culture, started a job where the culture was one of very, very fast pace in some areas, And then in areas that so for example, the actual speed with which people expected you to respond in an email, for example, and it was broad this way, right? Everybody has different expectations, but this was a cultural thing for the whole company. And yet there were gaps in terms of speed where it took you so long to get certain things done that you would think that this was a company that had 500,000 employees. And so, well, what does that mean? What's the cultural fit we were looking for when we hired people? Well, we needed people who were responsive and very service-oriented, but we were also trying to change the culture a little bit. And so we wanted people who were very good at collaborating, but would get a little bit discouraged and want to do something about it when it came to getting things done because it was taking too long. And so we would ask questions explicitly around demonstrate, have you been in a situation where you have had to push something along more quickly and people were resistant? And so we listened carefully for those answers, and the number of people who would interview would be sharing the feedback that they received. And so, I think you have to tailor the questions you ask to the cultural needs that you believe the organization has. And if you want to change the culture, or if you're expecting that this person needs to fit into the culture, it really depends. But it's critical because you're right. Everything can look good, and that's a deal killer. You won't be able to actually be successful.
One thing I know, David, is that a team with great players, a team with the right people usually wins, but it doesn't guarantee winning. So one of the way of doing it is that we have to consistently build the right team culture within the organization. I know that when you were with eBay and PayPal, you managed over 300 people globally. And with Adobe, you have managed over 100 people, and your current company with Red Cat, you're managing over 120 people. How do you develop team culture within this organization? Do you have a framework?
It's, again, a very important question. I'm glad you asked it. At PayPal and at both Adobe and currently at Red Cats, it's really all about how you view the world and what that world looks like in the eyes of the people who are in the organization, right? So, I wind up often wondering, you asked me this question, and I wonder, how everyone answers it, right? So different people have different approaches. My approach is really one around ensuring that the group dynamic is such that you have people positioned for success. And what I mean by that is, how do they interact with each other? What kind of framework do you put in place so that they can be successful, not just as a new team, because a lot of times I've inherited teams where there are people who are coming and going, or I've been asked to come in and change the direction of the team significantly, and that can often result in new people coming in and kind of changing the balance a little bit. But I think that, directly, that question goes right to the heart of what do you expect from people, right? What do you expect from them? And I expect that people have a great sense of pride in what they do, and you have to be able to tap into that in a way that gets them very excited about what it is that we're trying to accomplish. So, for example, I have faced at times people who came in and they said, we've been doing things this way, and we'd like to change those things, but we don't really know how. And so, it's a little bit about it is helping people get to that core of what it is that they're trying to do. Are you feeling, what is it that you're feeling about the resistance to making these changes, and what are the changes you're thinking of, and help them come to the conclusions themselves. And a lot of times they'll look to me for the answers, right? Well, you tell us what to do. And my most important point about that, and I learned it long ago, was that the notion that you have to teach people to fish. You can't just give them fish. And so, it's the culture of, is it a safe environment? Can you say anything? Can you raise issues? Can you speak up when people don't really want to speak up? I often say to people, I love the tough questions. I love the questions that nobody wants to ask because they're afraid of asking it and they're afraid of the repercussions. And so I feel as though when the success in what you just described is often measured by how comfortable people are really talking about the difficult issues and the difficult challenges openly and coming up with creative solutions to them. If you can create that environment, you've basically beaten out about 99% of the rest of the world.
I like what you're saying, and I'm trying to listen to your answer and trying to put it in a framework that I have adopted from a book called The 5 Dysfunction of a Team, written by Patrick Lencioni. And what he talks about there, that if you really want to build an effective team culture, you need to create an environment where people can speak their mind. I believe sometimes he used the word productive conflict. You have to let people to speak their mind, say things like it is. But people cannot really speak their mind unless they trust each other.
That's right.
So how do you build a culture where people get to know each other and can communicate with each other feelings, and that cannot be done unless the trust has been built. So trust,
yes,
combined with creating conflict, commitment, accountability, and constant focus on result can build a team culture. What's your assessment about that framework?
I think that, first of all, that book's an excellent book. I agree with you. It's wonderful. I often say, and even in my current job when I first came in, I often say to teams, I'm not interested in playing the blame game, because what the blame game does is that it pits people against one another and nobody's accountable. And so I think it starts with the leader effectively saying, I'm going to trust you, you are going to learn to trust me, and you absolutely have to learn to trust each other. And to me, often that barrier to overcome starts with people not being afraid to be accountable and recognizing that actually as a team, we're accountable. It's not necessarily about pointing fingers, but understanding what it is that has been a problem and how can we correct it. And sometimes it's something that does relate to one person's behavior or a group of people and how they're behaving, and you really have to have a heart-to-heart conversation with people about that. But I think that my experience has been, if you set the tone in such a way that, and you demonstrate trust and you demonstrate empowerment, and you say, look, I know you're going to make mistakes, but you're going to learn from them, and I'm going to be there to support you, and we just don't want to make the same mistakes over and over again, then I think people begin to gradually, those barriers begin to come down. And so it's not easy. You're right, it's a tough thing to do, but that framework is absolutely right on from my perspective.
When I was reading your LinkedIn profile, and I see that a lot of people are saying that you are a great motivator. So what I want to find out from you, what motivates people? How do you motivate your employees?
Well, I'm fond of an Andy Grove quote that you may have seen over the years, that where he said, former leader of Intel, yes, where he said,
went to City College.
Yeah, that's right. I can't motivate anybody. All I can do is create an environment where people can or cannot be motivated. And I really live by that. So I actually believe that and I've again been very fortunate to work for people who, over the years, I've learned from, that if you create an environment where trust exists, where it's safe and so they can say anything without fear of reprisal or repercussion, where people really get at the root of questions and issues, and where they believe in the vision and the strategy that you have, then I think that you are on your way to creating an environment where anyone can be motivated. And there are some who, even in that environment, aren't going to be, and they need to go on and do something else. And there have been plenty of instances where I've actually felt very good about helping people move into another career because they just weren't in the right place and they weren't motivated. So I think it is about that environment yet again.
Environment, as you mentioned,
right,
combined with the constant recognition, catching people doing things right, giving people the autonomy to do things their own way, and having a bigger purpose to make sure that they see a big picture and they can connect with that big purpose. And most importantly, if you can help people to become expert on whatever they're doing, then that motivates people. But do you agree with some of those assessments?
Absolutely. In fact, it's what you're saying is so fundamental, I think, to getting people engaged and keeping them productive and having them grow and become more than they even believed they could be. And that's exciting to watch. So it absolutely starts with a vision and a shared vision, one that people believe in, and also can connect their direct goals to, so that they feel they can see their actual contribution to that vision. When you do that well, people love to keep score. I think that's been my experience. They love to know how they're doing. People love feedback, and especially those people who are in a constant state of learning. So I just love the fact that you and your organization are all about lifelong learning, because I don't think that there's anything more important. After all, what is life about, right? I mean, you have a journey, whether it's through your employment or through your personal life, and as you learn as you go. And I don't believe that you reach a destination. I actually believe that you're taking a path, and the path is really up to you, depending on the decisions you make based on what you've learned. And so I find that everything you've just said about connecting purpose to people and their success is absolutely true.
In LinkedIn, when I looked at, and I want to point out how people defined you, they mentioned you lead by example, you have strong business acumen, you're a great motivator, you're intelligent, you are an inspirational leader, you are calm during crisis, you're visionary. So what I want to find out from you, what's your leadership style? What makes a good leader?
Well, I think it starts with authenticity. I think that it's very difficult to really even begin to talk about or think that you're a good leader if you aren't authentic, and even more importantly, if that authenticity doesn't shine through when you're talking with people. So I think it starts there, and then beyond that, it's communication, of course. It's being able to have a sense of vision and the importance of vision. I don't think that every great leader needs to have the vision of a Steve Jobs. I think he was a gifted man, and we were very lucky as a society to have had him. At the same time, I think there are many leaders, and I aspire to be one that have a very strong idea of what they think is right, an ability to communicate it, an ability to mobilize people and to engage them, and then throughout all of it, there's a sense of authenticity and trust that really doesn't let people down. I have a great story from a job where the people told me that after a few months they weren't sure what to make of me. And I said, well, you'll get to know me and I'll get to know you. And over time, over a period of months, they just kept saying, wow, we were very skeptical. And I said, well, tell me a little bit more about why. What is it? Because I want to learn if there's something that I'm doing when I first come in that is driving that skepticism. And they said, no, it was really the person before you and even the person before him. You're someone who actually is doing what they say they're going to do. And it struck me, that's such a simple thing. I said at the time, that seems like a very low bar. I'm saying I'm going to do something and then I do it. But what we don't realize is how often people make promises that they don't keep. We're not perfect, nobody is, right? But at the same time, when a large number of people in an organization respond to a simple, authentic, series of steps where you've actually said, okay, we're going to do this, we're going to do this, we're going to do this, and then you actually follow through. Follow through is very important to people, and I think that's the key from an authenticity perspective. So those are the things that I think define great leadership as far as I'm concerned, and I certainly aspire to do my best.
A lot of people mentioned, and I was talking about it earlier, that you are calm during crisis. Does your leadership style changes when there is a crisis within your organization?
No. It's a really important point. I think when people look to a leader during crises, they want to know how to respond. They do. They may not say that, they may not even think it, but they're looking for something, like help us figure out how we're going to do this. And in my experience, and I certainly have had times when early in my career I didn't do this well, it's the calm under pressure that helps people make better decisions when time is of the essence. And usually in a crisis, that's what happens. And so I believe that if you can set an example of being calm and very focused on coming up with a solution and very aware of what's going on, you'll get that same response from the people who work for you. And it's important because I have seen and been in enough situations early in my career where there was a crisis and the response was one of panic, and you always miss things in a panic. I had a wonderful professor, one of many wonderful professors in college. I went to the University of California at Berkeley for my undergraduate degree, and I'll never forget, it was a psychology class. And the first day of class, we were all sitting in the classroom, and all of a sudden someone ran across the stage. It was a large class, ran across the stage, and then someone ran after them saying, "He's got a gun." And everybody immediately went under their seats, and people weren't paying any attention. It was all staged. The psychologist the teacher actually later said, "Okay, did anyone see the person?" And of course you had wide variations in the height and the size, what they were wearing. Did anyone see the gun? And you had someone saying it was a shotgun, it was a pistol. He actually had a banana in his hand, and not one person in the room saw it. And I think what it really showed was that if you can maintain calm in those situations, you'll observe things and find solutions that you might not otherwise find.
I felt over the years that during crisis, I'm involved with the management a lot more. During crisis, I'm involved into the decision making. During crisis, when others are in panic, as you mentioned, yes, my goal is to go out there and calm people down and let them know. And during the crisis, a leader must be a lot more confident.
That's right.
So I feel sometimes that during the crisis, leadership style changes, but fundamental leadership concept still stays same.
I agree with you. It reminds me, you're absolutely right, and I really am glad that you mentioned the fast decisions. One of the exercises that I often do, I've done it with a couple teams, I shouldn't say often, a couple of my teams, including at Red Cats actually, was that I share with them the video story of Ernest Shackleton. I'm sure you're familiar with Ernest Shackleton, the famed Antarctic explorer, who in the early 1900s attempted to be the first person with about 20 plus people to walk across Antarctica. And unfortunately, disaster struck and they got stuck. And to a person, all of them survived. They were there for 2 years, and they all said it was because of their leader. And when you really dive into that and you show the video, I like to ask my team, keep track of all the decisions that he made through this ordeal, and it was quite an ordeal. And so they do that, and then I asked them to go back and identify which decisions were wrong decisions. And it's remarkable that about a third of them were actually wrong. Some, of course, jokingly said, well, the first decision that was wrong was to actually go to Antarctica, but that was part of his choice. What it really shows, and it drives to what you're saying, is that not only does it require fast decision making, but you also can't be daunted by mistakes, because you're going to make them. And one decision that's wrong doesn't mean that every decision you make afterwards is going to be wrong. So it was remarkable when you see how often he had to find some other way of doing something because he made a bad decision, but ultimately he achieved his goal.
What is the proudest moment in your life?
My proudest moment of my life? Well, I think I have a couple of them. I can't say that any more of them are more proud than others. I've been very fortunate in many ways. I have the obvious proud moment of watching my kids be born. I have a 14-year-old daughter and an 8-year-old daughter, and there's nothing that can really compare to that, both personally or professionally, the joy that you have of having another life brought into the world, and of course seeing them grow now. They're just amazing children, and so I'm very fortunate in that way. Professionally, I think that probably the proudest moment for me was when I mean, there are several of them, but I'm going to go back in my career a bit, was when I inherited a team that was pretty beaten up, I would say, over the years. I mean, it was, you know, people were saying this team is terrible, they don't know what they're doing, they're people who aren't qualified. And, you know, it took me about a year and a half to determine whether or not people were in the right roles, put a strategy together, move people around. Some people left, some people were hired and brought in. And we started doing great work. And the president of the company noticed and came by, and he said to me, you know, it was actually the division, it was a large division of company. He said, you know, how can we replicate this in other places? And I went through with him what we did, and I said, you know, it starts with the people. It starts with the teams and getting the people engaged in the right thing. You have to have a strategy and a vision, but you have to have the right people to carry it out in the right places. And I just felt so proud of my team because I said to him, you know, look, you shouldn't be talking just to me. Let's talk to the people on the team. And watching each one of them come up and present where they had been and where they'd come from to what they were doing was just incredibly fulfilling. Because I felt as though not only had we done something well for the business, but the people had actually grown and their lives were literally better because of the work that we had done together. And so I just felt very fortunate to be a part of that.
David, I want to share a quote with you. It's written by Oprah Winfrey. She said, "For every one of us that succeeds is because there's somebody there to show you the way out."
Yeah.
Do you have a mentor? Do you have that person?
I have had many mentors, and I have mentors today as well. I'm going to kind of reach back in my career again and pull one out that was particularly inspirational. In the early and mid 1990s, actually mid and late 1990s, I worked for Ascend Communications. Jeanette Simons was the CTO of that company. Unfortunately, she tragically died in a plane accident a few years back, but I had the great fortune of working for her for a number of years and working in her organization. And she was a hard-driving, you know, very demanding, probably one of the most intelligent people I have ever met, leaders. Just a quick explanation of her career. She was one of the first people who wrote Hayes modem code. She was a UCLA graduate, a frustrated gymnast who was supposed to go to the 1980 Olympics that were canceled in Moscow from the United States. And she was, you know, she had the patience of about a 5-year-old, but I've never seen anybody write code so fast. And my favorite Jeanette story was when and I learned so much from her, was when she said to me, you know, and this company was very small at the time, we need a bug database. And I said, okay. She said, and you're going to have to manage it. And I said, all right. She said, but let me go think about it for a little bit. And she went back to her office, and about 5 hours later, she came out with a compact PC in her hand. She said, here it is. And I said, here's what? She goes, there's the PC. I went ahead and, you know, installed the database. I put some metadata in there, and so it's all ready to go. And I was just like flabbergasted. And I looked at it and it was perfect. In fact, we used it for years later. What I learned from her, most importantly, was that you have to be impatient with yourself. You don't want necessarily to be highly impatient with others. And I learned from her that wasn't good because she did that often. But I noticed how much she was impatient with herself. She definitely, you know, looked inside and said, I know I'm a good person, I know I'm smart, I know what I'm doing, but I believe I can do it better. And it was interesting how that impatience manifested itself into great products and great technology. So I felt very fortunate to be a part of her organization, and I just remember how proud she was when we accomplished a bunch of things together. And you know, there were times when she got very upset and angry. Not my style, by the way. So I often have mentors whose leadership style is very different from mine because I feel like I can learn a lot from them. But she was one who had a tremendous impact on my career.
And I was talking to you about mentor over the years. My dad was my biggest mentor, but I saw that I have also had mentor in high school, I had mentor in college, I had mentor when I started the business. But what I saw that over the years, you who your mentor list changes, and sometimes you might outgrow your mentor. So do you have a dedicated plan to build a list of the mentor? Do you have a plan in place to build a mentor database, or working with a core group of 5 people in 5 different areas who is constantly advising you?
I do, and you know, it's interesting. I'm going to tie this together with a question or a comment you made earlier about some people don't learn enough about themselves in life until later. For me, that was the case. It took me a number of years, but I spent a lot of time several years ago putting together a total leadership plan based on the book by the same title. And in that plan, I absolutely have, you know, an approach for mentorship. My father is certainly one of my mentors as well, and I think, you know, we owe a lot to our parents in many ways, and funny how it manifests itself. As we get older, we realize just how lucky we are to have had them. And it's so interesting that we don't appreciate that quite as much when you're, you know, a teenager or a little older than that. But yes, I do have a plan for that, and I do have several mentors on whom I rely. And you're right, sometimes you do outgrow them. Interestingly enough, one of my mentors, who happened to be also a boss of mine years ago, is now a dear friend, and I find myself often in the situation of mentoring her. And she's very comfortable with it. And I'll never forget when that changed. And it changed when I had asked her to be a reference for me for a job many years ago. And she told the person who called to check my references that she would work for me. And this was very interesting, somebody who I'd worked for over the years. And I was really struck by that. I would say that early in my career, I was kind of a reluctant leader. I didn't really I didn't get uncomfortable, as you would say, but over the years, through really fortunate mentoring and some wonderful jobs, I've learned that, you know, there are things that I know I do well, and there are things that I don't do well, and I always try to surround myself with people to help shore up the parts of me that aren't as strong as I'd like.
David, I believe your dad was the president of FIT. And I want to tell you a little bit about me. I came from a culture, Asian culture, 21 years ago from Bangladesh to US. And the way the Asian culture works, where the parents kind of help you to shape your career. They kind of influence you to go to a direction that might not agree with your personal preference. Tell me a little bit about your dad and how he helped you to shape your future career.
Well, my dad is an amazing person, and of course I'm biased, but it's true. He was in Korea during the conflict there. He was in broadcasting for a number of years, and then, as I said, worked for the U.S. State Department in the USAID organization for a number of years, and then ultimately became the president of FIT. In the early and mid 1990s. You know, his influence on me, it's funny you should ask that question, because recently he gave me a 10-page document that he'd been typing for years about his life. You know, he's 81 years old. He celebrated his 81st birthday with me a few weekends ago, and it was wonderful for us to spend the time together. And I just, you know, was struck by how much I had learned from my dad. So, for example, my dad is an incredible communicator and writer. In fact, when he was president of FIT, he was invited to write a couple times, I think, for the New York Times, and he had some guest columns in there, guest spots in there, and he just impressed upon me the importance of written communication. He didn't really steer me to a specific career, but what he did say, and what he did demonstrated by example, because he has a doctorate, which, by the way, I don't have, he said, you know, the most important thing is to learn and learn and learn. Just educate yourself and don't stop doing that. He said, doesn't matter what you do, as long as you enjoy it, you're helping people, and you are satisfied with, you know, where you're going. And, you know, it's funny because it just shines through in those 10 pages that he sent me. And I thanked him the other day for him. I said, you know, I can't thank you enough for writing that down, because, you know, there were, first of all, things about my dad that I didn't know. You'd think that you know everything about your parents, but, you know, a lot of the little details that either got left out or over the years you didn't get. And so he had that huge impact of learning on me more than anything else.
Now, what advice do you have for young people who want to rise to the top?
Well, I think the first piece of advice, and this comes from, frankly, me not having done it early enough in my life, is to really be honest with yourself about yourself. I will never forget the first day in my graduate program, my master's in business administration. My forecasting professor put a curve on the board, and he didn't put any. You didn't know what was on the axes at all. There was just a curve, and he said, "This is the most important thing in your life." And everybody was, perplexed. What is it? And he said, "This curve, where you fall on this curve," and it was a risk curve. He said, "If you fall on this curve up here where you like to take risks, but you think you're down here, or vice versa, you're in deep trouble." So his message was, know where you are on that curve. And I didn't learn that lesson early enough. Early in my career, I was a bit risk averse. Then there was a period where I took too many risks. And I finally was honest with myself. These are the things you're good at, right? You're not good at some of this other stuff, and don't take those risks that are not calculated with this in mind. So my advice to young people is know where you fall on the risk curve, know yourself really well, and be brutally honest with who you are. Doesn't mean you can't grow and morph into other things, but if you deceive yourself, or you're not really at the know what the root of it is that makes you who you are, you're going to have trouble no matter what it is that you do. And then the other thing is just to, it's really what your organization does. It's lifelong learning. Don't ever stop learning. It's that my father, he can tell you when you talk to him, he's still taking classes. He's 81 years old. In fact, when I talked to him last night, he goes, "I'm writing a letter to the Boston Globe." So he's constantly using his mind and really stretching, and it's so inspirational and such a great example for me.
You had tremendous success in your life. You were the CEO of Stock Exchange. You hold major position with PayPal and eBay, Adobe, and now you have a leading position with Red Cat. But I'm more interested to find out about your failures. And I also want to know how those failures to help you to fail forward.
Well, first of all, I've had a lot of them, as most people who are successful have. I ascribe to the approach that fail fast and fail early and fail often, and then you will be successful. And there was a time in my life when the failures were devastating, and they still, they are still tough to get through, and they happen. Probably the earliest failure is really sort of a funny one. The first job I ever had was I was a waiter for 2 hours. Now, I don't know anybody who had a job that I literally was told by the maitre d', "Go home, you're in the way." And so, I knew at that point that I wasn't going to be a waiter, and it wasn't going to be my passion. But it was a good example of learning what you were good at and what you weren't good at doing.
And you failed fast.
And I failed fast. Sure, 2 hours, that's a fast failure. Can't say that I've had any failures like that as quickly. One other failure that was really difficult for me, it was actually at Ascend Communications. I was tasked with building a team and an infrastructure that brought a content management system into this company that was on its way to being a billion-dollar company. And I had never done that before. I'd never actually evaluated a content management system. This was very early in my career. And we went about it. I thought we'd made the right choice. We spent a lot of money, and it never achieved the results that it was intended to achieve. And I was haunted by it. In fact, the next job I took was at Adobe, and one of the things I was supposed to participate in was helping to do the same thing. And the same thing happened at PayPal. And fortunately, in the 2 following jobs after Ascend, I participated in it, and PayPal actually led the effort and was successful in pulling that together. But it was because of the lessons that I learned. A great example is that we thought it was wonderful to have in the content management system so many different ways that you could look up pieces of content. Well, of course, that resulted in tons of metadata, far too much that cluttered it up, and we wound up with a taxonomy that would have made even the most complicated and bright person run for the exits. So we learned at that point, afterward, I learned that simplicity in that area and in many areas is much better than complexity. I know that seems like a very obvious statement, but very hard to actually do when you are in an environment where you're faced with a lot of complicated devices and all kinds of processes. And so you have to really ask yourself constantly, is this as simple as it can be? Because there's such a tendency to perpetuate that complexity. So that was a big failure for me. And then personally, I've had a business failure before. It's not an easy thing to say that you've gone through, but it makes you stronger when you get through it. You do very well to learn the lessons, and that's when you really ask yourself, okay, what could I have done differently? But I also know that many successful business people fail, and that always kept me going. And it's often because of those lessons that you wind up being even more successful than you imagine. So I consider those failures a gift. Someone once asked me, do you actually fail intentionally? And I said, no, nobody wants to fail. But one of the lessons that I have learned is to know when to say enough. And sometimes people fight till the end. And I believe that you need to fight and you need to continue to persevere. But I also believe that there's a point at which banging your head against the wall is not necessary, and you don't learn anything from it except you get a headache. So it's been great. I'm sure I'll have more successes and failures in my life, and they're both gifts.
Great. Fail fast, fail early, fail often.
Yeah.
I like that. David, I want to read a quote written by Jack Welch. He's one of my mentor. Initially, he was a book mentor. I read all of his books written about him. Eventually, I had opportunity to take a few classes with him. And Jack Welch once said, an organization's ability to learn and translate that learning into action is the ultimate competitive advantage. How do you build a learning organization?
Well, I think that it's not simple, that's for sure. If it were simple, a lot of people would be doing it very easily. I think it starts, of course it starts again, as it often does, with setting an example. I often tell my folks that, I don't know everything, but I'm good at knowing where to go for answers often if I don't. And I also know when I have to shore up my knowledge. And so, as an example, and this happens in technology all the time, right? In fact, with the Facebook IPO and NASDAQ having technical problems, it's a great example. What would NASDAQ learn from that? What would the people inside that organization learn? And I found myself in those situations over the years, involved in technology just as often as most people do, leading this kind of an effort. And so, I tell people, look, we need to have, first of all, an understanding of, is this something we need to learn, right? What do we need to learn at sort of its base level? And then I like to use the metaphor that's used in the technology world, what we call A/B testing or multivariate testing, where you on a website, for example, you would display two different versions of something. Of course, the customer would only see one, but they would be different in that you would want to know, would this page perform better than that page? And so we call that test and learn. And so I like to apply that really to my teams, which is, okay, so we think we have a hypothesis on something, let's test it and let's learn about it. But I'm even more interested, so that's kind of at a broad level for the organization, but I think you have to look at it at an individual level. And it goes back to what I said earlier about really taking an active interest in people's careers and literally requiring that they have a learning agenda and a learning plan. And so to me, those individual learning plans, along with a strategy and vision, can roll up into an overall learning plan for an organization and an agenda that has to endure beyond any leader or any team member or anything. And I think you need a place where this is where technology comes in very nicely, where it is your knowledge management environment, where you can house all of this knowledge, whether it's what are all the skills of the people we have, and gosh, I have a question about this technology, who do I go to something that somebody might have learned about a specific part of the code base, for example, or something like that. So I think it requires a lot of discipline. It requires a formula. I like the way your organization approaches it, and it's one of the reasons we reached out to you. I think that we are in a very dynamic time in society, and people are learning. There's so much information, and you can be overwhelmed with it. And so it's really a question of focusing on what's the most important stuff to learn at the moment, and then being able to apply that to what you're facing. And we absolutely are putting together a learning plan and agenda. Each person on the team has to have one. And then when that happens, everybody recognizes how important it is to the organization. So I think it's not easy, as I said, but it is critical to the success of the group.
Every time I see that organization is not growing, I invest more on our employee training and development. And I know that a great organization like GE also invest tremendously on the employee development.
Yeah.
But I also saw that a lot of companies, during the recession period, when time is bad, first thing they cut is their training budget. Why do you think it's important to invest in employee training and development?
Well, I think it goes to the heart of what we talked about in the very beginning, which is if you don't have your people in the right roles and the right places, the right time, almost nothing else you do will be successful. And the add-on to that is, and I said it earlier a little bit, is that you have to develop those people. You have to. You don't take an active role in their career and encourage them to do so, and that includes having a training plan and learning what it is that you need to grow, then you will not be successful. And so what you're saying doesn't surprise me at all. I think a lot of companies and organizations, when bad times hit, they tend to recoil. This is an interesting thing I've seen at different places, different groups and different cultures react differently, right? Some people react to tough times by just, it's the siege mentality. Okay, close the doors, cut all the costs. We're just going to ride it out until the storm passes. And I think that if you do only that, you actually create a huge problem for yourself, because it's the great organizations and companies that invest when it's the hardest to do so and when no one else is. And so I believe that to me it's not a variable cost, really, when I think about it. I know it's in the accounting world it's considered a variable cost, but I consider it a fixed cost, that you need to have that investment going on just as you would invest in keeping the lights on in your facility. Unfortunately, not a lot of people believe that, nor do they live by that, but I do, and it's absolutely correct, I think, what you're saying.
How do you measure training ROI?
Well, it's interesting. I think it goes back to the individual training plans. I'll give you an example because I think that probably is the best way to describe it. I had an employee a few years ago who asked me, when we talked about what aspirationally was really, what do they want to do? They said, well, I want your job. And I said, okay, that's good to know. Well, let's talk about what it is that you need to be able to get there. And so we then did a bunch of exercises, some of which were provided by the company and some of which I had gone through over the years, and so I saved, and it included understanding what skills you have, what skills you need, what experiences you have, what experiences you need, and putting that plan together. And then it's interesting because this particular employee was a critical employee. She happened to be one of two people who were my potential successors and part of my succession plan. If I lost her, which was possible, I would be in a bad spot because she was also managing a large part of the organization. And she was also responsible for some of the innovation that was going on in the team. We had some very innovative projects going on, and she had a real bent towards this. Plus, she was not from the United States, and she had a global view. So there were so many reasons to try to keep her engaged. And so it was an example of keeping her active and engaged through her learning plan. So she proceeded down that plan, and we step by step, she went through each thing that we needed to do, and I would measure her specific ROI on the ROI of the projects that she managed because she was still there. She was a flight risk had I not done this, and so I'm happy to say that she'd moved on to other roles after I left that were more expansive, is on the verge, in fact, I believe right now, on actually taking a role that was similar to mine. And so I'm very proud of her. Yeah, what I was really happy to see is that her learning plan didn't stop when I left. She continued on with it, and I think that, so I would measure ROI by the successes associated with the people with whom you've invested in learning. I think you can really get to that directly. And there are many times when people aren't going to grow, they're not going to be able to take on additional projects. You can also expand them into areas that they wouldn't otherwise have, and then you can take the ROI of those projects. So I'm a very big believer in tying directly the projects on which someone is working and leading related to the training they've received to be capable of leading those projects effectively.
How do you develop an effective learning plan? I have a framework that I use, is similar to a lot of other companies are using, but this framework is going to go to my future book called Learning Plan, where I believe that when you develop a learning plan, you got to have a learning goal, you need to have a competency model, then you need to combine different type of learning method to make sure that person can develop those competencies, and most importantly, you're going to constantly evaluate your plan to see if you have to make any adjustment, and it's an ongoing process happen year after year after year. What is your framework?
Well, it's interesting. I think that what you just described makes a lot of sense, and is very similar to how I think about it. I often start with what is it that, there are several questions to sort of get people to understand themselves before they create a learning plan. It goes back to my point earlier. If you don't really know yourself and you're not honest with yourself, it's hard to be successful. And I think it's hard to create a learning plan at that point too. So I always start with things like, what have people always told you were good at doing? What do you enjoy? Generally, if you enjoy certain things, and I try to make it as broad as I can, then there's a reasonable chance that you're good at them. I am a believer in Marcus Buckingham's, what the great managers do, sort of now discover your strengths type of philosophy. But I also know that it's important for you to be aware of where you're not strong, because then you can actually, you can certainly make some improvement there, but more importantly, you can surround yourself with other team members or people who work for you who can basically have those areas covered. And so I think it starts off with knowing yourself and getting to those questions, and then really understanding what is it that you want. And I kind of fall back on my own experience in putting together a total leadership plan, where I had to synthesize down into a sentence or two what it is that out of life that I want. And essentially it's having a fulfilled life, and here are the things that make that for me. And when I do that, and then you start thinking about what drives that fulfillment, now I can start thinking about, okay, these are those areas where I really feel like I need to do things, whatever it is. And so one of the folks that worked for me for years said, I want to be able to be doing something where I'm making a difference in technology, where I'm known for what I'm doing. And I said, okay, that's a great goal. Now let's figure out what you need to do. You need to, and so we'd go through the areas. Well, if you're going to be known, the only way you're going to know anything is if you have to be knowledgeable. Then you have to have the ability to communicate it in a variety of ways, in a way that gets people's attention. So there's an aspect of communication and marketing there. And so we kind of went down the list. We created this very comprehensive training plan, and I think it was really around what do you want to be, knowing that over time that may change. So you have to revisit it. And then there's the bottom line, which is how do I know that I've acted? To your question about ROI, I almost refer to it as personal ROI, right? Am I investing the right amount of time in this activity to get the result that I want? And if you're not investing the right amount of time, or you're not investing in the right places, it's a problem. So I try to use it almost as the plan as almost a some way to track success. It's not just about the ultimate goal, but how am I doing on the way? So it's I don't think it's as crisp as yours, because I think it's your field and you obviously do it very well. But I like what you're saying, and I can see how there are things that from my experience that fit well with that.
One of the guy that I admire tremendously over the years, he's my book mentor. His name is Peter Drucker.
Yes.
And I'm sure you're in the leadership position and you know about him. And Peter Drucker once said, in our knowledge economy, if you haven't learned how to learn, you will have hard time. So we really need to know how to learn, and we really need to learn how to combine different type of learning method in order to become an effective learner. What do you think is the most effective learning method?
Well, I think it varies for different people. And I've had this conversation with a number of people before. I think that what we're learning from the world around us is that people really want to be connected to one another. Whether you're looking at Facebook or LinkedIn or any of the tools, you can see that those social connections are very critical. And so while I am a big believer that in e-learning, in the sense that you can learn a certain amount of stuff on your own, sort of a self-paced self-study, I just don't think that it can be replaced completely by either classroom participation or an engaged group of people learning together, because you learn from each other. And so I don't I have a tough time trying to think of what is the best one, other than to say I don't think e-learning exclusively 100% of the time. Like if somebody went through all of their years of schooling and all they did was e-learning, you would wind up with a person who had very little social interaction and skills, and they wouldn't be able to function in society. Some level of that I think is okay for some things, but ultimately I think it's the blended type of approach where you get the benefit of the technology, but then you can also absolutely engage with other people who are taking classes, and that's how, in my opinion, that's how you learn.
I used to love classroom training. I loved that interaction.
Yes.
I loved that discussion. I still continuously, I like that. But I have so much curiosity, and I find reading books is a great way to learn.
Yes.
Fastest way to learn for me.
Yeah.
I also know people, I see that they're really bad in classroom. But if you provide them that on-the-job, one-on-one training, they are really, really good at that. So as a good leader, when we develop individual learning plan, we must not only focus on their goal and looking into their competency model, we need to also pay attention of their learning style so that we can develop an effective learning method and learning plan for that person to reach their goal.
You're absolutely right. It varies from person to person. I can't agree with you more. It's a personal preference. In some cases, it's the way people are most excited about learning. I found it interesting that I know that, and I see this with my daughters, in certain circumstances, if something online is very engaging, if it's very interactive, they will do much better than if they are looking at it somewhere else, right? Reading a book or passively watching a TV program, or even just listening to somebody talk. But I do think that it takes multiple ways of learning, and I think the one-on-one that you described, the person who can't really learn as well in a setting that's different from that, I think you're absolutely right. Those learning plans have to be tailored not just around what you're learning, but also how you're learning and the methods in which you choose. And so I think that's a great reminder of that.
And David, one of the things I see, a big organization like yours, Red Cats, that has $3.8 billion, and you have employees all over the world, and different department has different best practices, and all this knowledge is getting created within the organization. and most organizations finding it difficult to manage their knowledge. And I know that you worked on similar type of knowledge management projects in the past.
Yes.
How do you manage organizational knowledge effectively?
Well, it's interesting how much of a problem it is in every place in which I've worked, right? People refer to it as the tribal knowledge way of sharing information. Nothing ever gets written down, nothing ever gets stored anywhere. It's usually in somebody's head, and then when that person leaves, the knowledge goes with it. And so I think that it comes down to making knowledge management a critical element in your organization's learning agenda, and it can be something as rudimentary as just storing documents, but that runs its course pretty quickly. I think the best examples of those that I have, those type of organizations I have in my career, frankly, I go back to my Ascend days, because the company was certified, ISO 9001 certified for not just manufacturing but development. And what that meant was that everything we did had to be written down and stored in a database. And the fascinating thing about that is that you could, of course, you had metadata on which to search things. You could tell me, find every instance of this, but you also could do a full text search because it was indexed as full text. And this was the days before, just before Google and the search engines became available. But it's amazing how much of that needs to be really carefully tuned, right? Because if you just start storing stuff, you're going to just wind up with a big mess ultimately. And so I believe that you have to not only have a very deliberate plan and strategy for knowledge management, but you actually have to have somebody managing it. Otherwise, it just spins out of control. And it's interesting because people don't really know what you're talking about when you say knowledge management. I'm sure you've had this happen. Outside of most circles, or in most circles, they don't. But when you explain to people and then you show them what's possible, like, oh, you mean I can find out about this, it becomes this whole nother world to them. And my experience with it has been that people just, they begin to get so addicted to that they feel lost when they go somewhere else and that doesn't exist.
David, I must tell you that I had 20 other questions for you. I'm enjoying the discussion so much. And I know if I go on, it's going to go on for another 2-3 hours. So I think we have to do another session in future.
Sure.
I want to personally thank you for coming in here and spending so much time with us. You are such a deep thinker, such a clear thinker. You have such a vast amount of knowledge. And I will repeat again, I really believe that Red Cats is lucky to have you in their team. So I want to thank you again.
Thank you, Russell. It's been a pleasure.
No problem.